In the spring of 1778, after 3 years of war, the situation in the rebellious North American colonies had become dramatic for the British. Although between 1776 and 1777, the main British army, under Sir William Howe, had achieved major successes, at least on paper, repeatedly defeating George Washington and securing New York, Philadelphia, and Rhode Island. The year 1777 ended in disaster. The unexpected defeat of John Burgoyne's army, which had set out from Canada aiming to push towards Albany and secure control of the Hudson Valley. But the lack of coordination between Howe and Burgoyne, along with the logistical difficulties the latter faced, led to the surrender of his entire army at Saratoga, October 17, 1777. Now the chances that France, which had secretly been financing the Americans for some time, would finally take the plunge and declare war on Great Britain, bringing into the conflict the weight of its army and above all its navy, were very high. During the winter of 1777 to 1778, the British government faced a dilemma. Either accelerate the mobilization of the fleet so as to be ready, thereby however giving France a pretext to declare war, or wait and hope until the last moment that King Louis XVI and his advisors might change their minds. The British chose the latter option, but it was all in vain. On February 6, 1778, France signed a commercial treaty and alliance with the rebellious colonies. At the very same time that Parliament was voting to send a peace commission to America with genuine powers of negotiation, in addition to the 2 commissioners already there, the outgoing General Howe and his brother, Admiral Lord Richard. Informed by its spies of the treaty's existence, on March 10 the government authorized naval commanders to attack any rebel vessel, even if escorted by French ships. On March 13 the French informed the British government of the commercial treaty with the United States, and thus of their recognition of the rebellious colonies as independent states. For the British government this was unacceptable, and the ambassador in Paris, Viscount Stormont, was recalled. France was now officially an enemy. France's entry into the conflict dramatically changed the strategic outlook facing the British government. Unless Great Britain could rapidly secure a decisive victory at sea, it would lose the absolute naval control that had allowed it to sustain the logistical effort of the war in America. Furthermore, the French fleet could threaten and seize the British Caribbean islands, extremely wealthy and important possessions. Finally, if the French gained strategic supremacy in the English Channel, they might even invade the British Isles. For precisely this reason, the British government, gripped by uncertainty, decided to take drastic measures. General Sir Henry Clinton, who had replaced Sir William Howe, was ordered to evacuate Philadelphia and even, if necessary, New York and Rhode Island, and to send around 10,000 men to the West Indies. In Europe, the Channel Fleet was fully mobilized to face the French assembling at Brest. But there remained the uncertainty of the Second French Fleet, that of Toulon. Since the British were unable to blockade Toulon, this fleet might reinforce Brest, giving France the numerical superiority that so alarmed the British government. Or it might sail to America, striking directly at the Caribbean, which was temporarily undefended, or coordinating with the Americans. In either case, Lord Howe's fleet would find itself at a serious numerical disadvantage. On the 11th of April, the Toulon fleet put to sea, with 11 ships of the line, a 50-gun ship, and several frigates, under the command of Admiral d'Estaing. Despite the fleet's rather slow progress, the British government hesitated to attempt interception in the Mediterranean. In the end, it decided on a cautious line, refusing to detach a squadron from the Channel Fleet until it was certain of d'Estaing's destination. Only on the 29th of April, after recent intelligence left little doubt that the French were heading for the Atlantic and America, did the government detach 13 ships of the line to pursue the French and, meanwhile, inform Admiral Howe of the enemy's approach. However, the slowness of d'Estaing's navigation created uncertainty in the British government and led it to place the decision already made on standby. The squadron detached to intercept him, under Admiral Byron, grandfather of the future poet, was kept at Portsmouth until early June, when the last doubts about D'Estaing's direction were dispelled. On the 9th of June, Byron set sail in pursuit of the enemy fleet, which nonetheless possessed a commanding lead. The great unknown was whether Lord Howe would be able to face the French until Byron arrived. In America, Admiral Howe was still unaware of the French approach. Delays and intercepted dispatches meant that the news only reached the British Admiral on the 29th of June, when the French were already only a few days from the American coast. This delay might have proved fatal. Had Lord Howe not been an extremely prudent officer and already taken into account this possibility, keeping his fleet on maximum alert. In America, at the beginning of June, Howe and Clinton had organized the evacuation of Philadelphia. The fleet would transport part of the civilians who wished to follow the British, while the army would march across New Jersey to Sandy Hook. There, the fleet would ferry the soldiers to Staten Island and New York. On the 28th of June, Washington's attempt to intercept the retreating British led to the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse, a largely inconclusive engagement, after which Clinton resumed his march towards the sea. Between the 1st and the 5th of July, the entire British Army left New Jersey, finding refuge in New York. 3 days later, on the 8th of July, D'Estaing's fleet arrived off the entrance to Delaware Bay. Lord Howe had now been in America for 2 years. The hopes of a peaceful solution with which he had arrived in 1776 had been shattered by American intransigence. The naval blockade of the American coast had proved a failure, both for lack of sufficient ships and because of the Admiral's relatively soft approach and his preference for supporting his brother's military operations. Yet, at the end of November 1776, the fortune of the two brothers had reached its height, when they proclaimed pardon for all rebels who laid down their arms, and thousands accepted. Victory seemed inevitable, and the Howes were celebrated in Britain as the heroes who had restored order and peace in America. But George Washington continued to fight, and in 1777, despite further British victories, laurels gave way to accusations of collusion, lack of fighting spirit, or worse, corruption and incompetence. Saratoga was the final blow to the brothers' standing. Sir William, completely disheartened, sought permission to return home, which was granted in the spring of 1778. Lord Richard, although subjected to less severe criticism and less inclined to despair than his brother, was by now disgusted, exhausted, and eager to return home to answer his accusers. In May, together with the news that the French had officially entered the war, though not yet that the French fleet was coming to America, Howe received permission from the government to return home once Admiral Byron arrived. Despite having under his nominal command 92 warships, in reality these were mostly small vessels suited only to troop transport or coastal patrol, and Howe possessed only 8 ships of the line, none larger than 64 guns, 4 50-gun ships, and several frigates. The fleet was in good working order, despite the lack of major American ports suitable for naval repair, but it was clearly outgunned by the French. D'Estaing commanded 11 ships of the line, 1 90-gun ship, 1 80-gun ship, 4 74-gun ships, 3 64-gun ships, plus a 50-gun vessel. Howe's only significant advantage lay in the number of frigates. 8 against the French 3. As well as greater experience and military skill than his opponent. Whereas Howe was an experienced sailor and commander, with major naval operations behind him and a strong aptitude for fleet command, D'Estaing was impulsive, with mediocre navigational ability. He had entered the Navy only after beginning his career in the Army. And, despite great courage and aggressiveness, had never commanded at sea. He did, however, possess some able subordinates, including Bougainville and Suffren. Having received word of the French arrival on the 8th of July, Howe worked feverishly in the following days to block the enemy's entry into New York Bay. Navigation in New York Bay was anything but easy, due to currents and sandbanks that could strand large ships. The experienced British admiral knew this well and intended to use it to his advantage. First, he had a battery of 5 guns constructed at the tip of Sandy Hook, then anchored 6 ships along the southern end of the channel. Howe fitted spring cables to the port anchors of each ship so that, by hauling or slackening the lines, they could swing on their anchors and concentrate or redirect their broadsides without changing position. In this way, if the French attempted entry into the bay, their ships would be raked by British broadsides and the shore battery. A further defense lay in the fact that the sandbanks allowed entry only at high tide and with winds from the east or southeast. Any French ships that succeeded in passing would almost certainly suffer damage to rigging or hull and struggle to maneuver inside the bay, where Howe's reserve ships could fall upon them. Each ship's crew had been reinforced with troops from shore. On the 11th of July, the French fleet approached the entrance to New York Bay, but d'Estaing hesitated, gathering more information on the currents and awaiting American pilots. For 11 days, the French remained offshore, uncertain what to do. Expert American navigators warned of the great navigational danger, and the French admiral finally withdrew on the 22nd of July without even attempting to force Howe's strong position. New York, for the moment, was safe. However, the French withdrawal from New York created a new dilemma for the British. Where would the fleet go next? In mid-July, George Washington had ordered General John Sullivan to prepare to attack Rhode Island, where 5,000 British soldiers under General Pigot were stationed. D'Estaing now sailed there, arriving on July 29th. Between the 29th and the 30th of July, the French fleet positioned itself at the entrance to the Middle and West Channels, while Captain Suffren's squadron attacked British batteries on Connecticut Island, forcing the British to evacuate the island, destroying several ships to prevent them falling into French hands. On August 1st, the French were in full control of the channels, while the British were concentrated only around Newport. On August 3rd, the American forces were reinforced by 2 brigades under Major General the Marquis de Lafayette. But Sullivan's excessive caution delayed the American attack until August 9th, provoking the impatience of the fiery D'Estaing. Howe and Clinton in New York received reliable information that D'Estaing had sailed for Rhode Island only on July 28th. The British admiral prepared to sail, despite his numerical inferiority. On July 30th, the Cornwall, 74 guns, reached New York with bad news. Byron's squadron had been scattered by a storm in the Atlantic. Howe could rely only on this single reinforcement. Altogether, he possessed 32 ships, but of these only 8 were ships of the line, against 11 French. But the risk had to be taken. Contrary winds kept the British fleet in port until August 6th. On August 9th, Sullivan began the attack on Newport, supported by the French fleet. But around midday, Lord Howe's fleet was sighted off Point Judith. Howe decided to halt and not immediately attempt to relieve Newport. His mere presence, however, demanded action from the Franco-American forces. At 9 a.m. on August 10th, D'Estaing, taking advantage of a favorable northeasterly wind, left Middle Channel and headed into open sea to confront Howe. The British admiral also headed south with his ships of the line and frigates. Being inferior in firepower, he wanted to gain the weather gauge, hoping that the wind might later change direction. But this did not occur, and by 3 a.m. on August 11th, the French were already close to his rear, to windward of the British fleet. Howe, realizing he could not obtain the weather gauge by relying on a mere change of wind, and also wishing to avoid moving too far from Rhode Island, decided to change strategy. He carried out a series of wide circular maneuvers, first turning south, then southwest, west, and finally northwest, always maintaining an orderly line of battle. D'Estaing followed on the outside of the arc, with greater speed, but ended up leeward of the British by afternoon. At that point, around 4 in the afternoon, a single tack by Howe's fleet would have allowed him to fall upon the French and deprive them of the windward advantage. With a single elegant, disciplined maneuver, Howe had turned an apparent retreat into a trap, reversing the situation in his favor. By then, however, the wind and waves had become so strong that the French were discouraged from engaging, and as darkness fell and rain began, the French fleet bore away south-southwest. On the night of August 11th, a great storm began, lasting until August 13th, scattering and damaging both fleets. In the following days, apart from occasional clashes between single ships, the two admirals devoted their efforts mainly to reforming their fleets and making them operational again. On August 15th, Howe turned south, while the French headed north. The British fleet was restored to fighting condition very quickly, and on August 25th it was already at sea, heading towards Rhode Island. But on August 22nd, D'Estaing had sailed for Boston to place his fleet in safety. At this point, Howe made perhaps the only questionable decision of his career. Instead of heading for Rhode Island, where his fleet could easily have surrounded and isolated Sullivan and Lafayette, he tried to intercept D'Estaing, who, because of the damage to his ships, would have been unable to sail close inshore. Howe's plan was to pass between Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket, and intercept D'Estaing off Cape Cod or at the entrance to Massachusetts Bay. But this time D'Estaing had moved rapidly, and on August 30th, he was already safe inside Boston Harbor, while Howe only reached Boston that evening. The next day, having observed the strength of the harbor defenses, Howe hesitated, and on September 2nd withdrew to Rhode Island. On August 30th, Sullivan had already retreated, while British reinforcements under General Gray sailed from New York. Howe's fleet remained off Rhode Island, while Gray organized a raid on Martha's Vineyard. On September 11th, Howe's fleet returned to New York, where he finally found some of Byron's ships. The admiral was at last free to return home. On September 24th, he returned to Newport, where Byron was stationed, to formally hand over command, and 2 days later, aboard the Eagle, he set sail for Britain. On October 30th, at Portsmouth, Howe finally hauled down his flag. The war in America, for him, was over. Now began the battle against his critics. Howe's reputation in America had been tarnished. Public opinion did not understand, or chose to distort for partisan reasons. His maneuvers, the scale of the immense challenge he had faced, and his professionalism. And yet, always with inferior forces, to save in a single campaign, the fleet, New York, Rhode Island, and the entire British Army was an achievement that few in the history of defensive naval warfare can match. In 1779, the Parliamentary Board of Inquiry requested by Sir William Howe to judge his conduct in America, and implicitly also that of his brother, acquitted him of every serious charge. But the two Howes, weary, embittered, and wounded by criticism, placed themselves firmly in opposition to the North administration. In 1780, Sir William did not stand for re-election, while Lord Richard, still in Parliament, stubbornly refused every invitation to return to service. Everything changed in 1782. After the disaster of Yorktown, North's administration fell and was replaced by the very opposition that had long criticized its American policy. Lord Howe then returned to command of the Channel Fleet, and once again demonstrated that extraordinary ability that later led Lord Nelson to call him the first and greatest sea officer the world ever produced. In 1794, the glorious 1st of June finally raised Howe into the Olympus of the great admirals of history. While his opponent of that epic summer of 1778, the brave but unfortunate D'Estaing, paid with his life for his loyalty to his king, ascending, like so many others in that turbulent age, the steps of the guillotine.